July 26, 1865. Lieutenant Caspar Collins led 25 cavalrymen out of Platte Bridge Station in Wyoming Territory, riding to rescue a supply wagon train under attack. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that 300 Sioux warriors were waiting in the ravines just ahead. They'd been there since dawn, perfectly still, their horses trained from birth not to whinny or stamp. Collins rode straight into the trap. Within minutes, arrows came from everywhere at once, not from a line of warriors you could charge, but from scattered positions in the tall grass, from behind rocks, from riders who appeared and vanished like smoke. Collins died within sight of the fort. His men never had a chance to form a defensive position. The Sioux didn't fight like European armies. They fought like the land itself had come alive. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now, if you want to understand what happened at Platte Bridge Station, if you want to understand how Collins and thousands of soldiers after him walked into a kind of warfare they'd never imagined, you need to understand where Sioux tactics came from. And that story begins not on battlefields, but in childhood. A Sioux boy started his warrior training around age 6 or 7, not with wooden swords or toy guns, but with something much more fundamental: vision quests. These weren't some mystical experience separate from combat training. They were the psychological foundation of everything that came after. A boy would go alone into the wilderness, fasting, waiting for a vision that would guide his entire life. Imagine the mental toughness that built. 10 years old, alone on a hillside for days, no food, no shelter. The visions they received, whether you believe they were spiritual or simply the product of hunger and isolation, gave them something extraordinary. Absolute certainty in battle. No hesitation. They'd already faced death alone in the darkness. A line of cavalry didn't scare them, but the spiritual preparation was just the beginning. The real revolution came with horses. The Sioux had only acquired horses in the early 1700s, but within a few generations they'd become the finest light cavalry the world had ever seen. And I'm not exaggerating. British cavalry officers who later studied Sioux tactics admitted they'd never seen anything like it. The training started young. A boy would ride before he could properly walk. By adolescence, he could hang off the side of a galloping horse, using the animal's body as a shield while shooting arrows under its neck. He could guide his horse with just his knees, leaving both hands free for weapons. He could ride at full gallop through broken terrain that would kill a European cavalryman. This wasn't entertainment. This was warfare evolved for the Great Plains open ground where visibility stretched for miles, where traditional infantry formations were useless, where mobility was everything. Then came the warrior societies. The Kit Fox, the Crow Owners, the Strong Hearts. These weren't just social clubs. They were tactical units with their own traditions, their own standards of courage, their own specialized roles in battle. Young warriors competed for membership. To join the Kit Fox Society, you had to prove yourself in combat, demonstrate absolute fearlessness, show that you'd rather die than retreat from a position you'd chosen to defend. These societies taught tactics passed down through generations, refined through countless battles against Crow, Pawnee, Shoshone enemies. One tactic that particularly terrified soldiers was the coup count. It sounds almost sporting when you first hear about it. Warriors competed to touch enemies in battle without killing them, to steal weapons from their hands, to demonstrate bravery so absolute it seemed insane to military minds. But it had a tactical purpose. It created warriors so psychologically dominant, so contemptuous of danger, that they'd ride straight into gunfire to strike an enemy with a coup stick. Imagine you're a soldier in a defensive position. You're shooting at a charging warrior. He keeps coming. You hit him, you know you hit him, but he doesn't stop until he touches you with his hand or his stick. That psychological impact was devastating. The Bozeman Trail changed everything. The United States wanted a road through Sioux territory to reach gold fields in Montana. Didn't matter that the 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie had promised that land would remain Sioux forever. Didn't matter that the trail cut straight through the Powder River country, the richest buffalo hunting grounds remaining. Prospectors and settlers were going through, and the army would protect them. Red Cloud saw what was coming. He was 44 years old in 1866, already famous as a war leader, but this was different from traditional plains warfare. This wasn't about horse raids or territorial disputes with rival tribes. This was existential. The buffalo were disappearing. If the trail stayed open, if forts full of soldiers remained in the hunting grounds, the Sioux way of life would end. So Red Cloud did something unprecedented. He unified the Sioux bands, brought in Cheyenne and Arapaho allies, and organized a coordinated military campaign that would last for years. This wasn't a raid. This was strategic warfare. And riding alongside Red Cloud was a young warrior named Crazy Horse, 25 years old, already known for an almost supernatural calm in battle. He'd had his vision quest years before, saw himself riding through gunfire untouched, saw his people in distress. Now he was putting those visions into practice, developing hit-and-run tactics that made a mockery of West Point training. Here's what those tactics looked like. A supply column would leave a fort, heading for another outpost. The soldiers knew Sioux warriors were out there somewhere. They'd march in tight formation, weapons ready, scanning the horizon. Nothing. Hours of nothing. Then, miles from help, arrows from a dozen hidden positions. Warriors would appear, fire, and vanish before soldiers could mount a charge. If the soldiers broke formation to pursue, more warriors would hit them from another direction. If they stayed together, the harassment continued for hours, men and animals slowly being picked off. The soldiers called it cowardice. They wanted a stand-up fight, line against line, the way war was supposed to work. The Sioux called it intelligence. Why lose warriors in a frontal assault when you could bleed an enemy slowly, without risk? Why fight on their terms when the entire landscape was your ally? And it was working. By late 1866, the forts along the Bozeman Trail were under siege. Not siege in the traditional sense, no army surrounding the walls, but something more insidious. Soldiers couldn't leave without getting attacked. Supply trains couldn't get through. Wood-cutting details couldn't gather fuel without a military escort. The forts were prisons, and the guards were trapped inside. Then, on December 21st, 1866, Captain William Fetterman made a boast that would define everything that followed. He said, and witnesses recorded this, that with 80 men, he could ride through the entire Sioux nation. 80 men, against thousands of warriors who'd been training for this kind of warfare since childhood. He was about to get his wish. Captain William Fetterman got his 80 men, exactly 80 infantry and cavalry combined. On December 21st, 1866, he rode out of Fort Phil Kearny with explicit orders from Colonel Henry Carrington: relieve the wood train under attack, but do not pursue beyond Lodge Trail Ridge. Do not cross that ridge. Carrington knew what lay beyond broken terrain, perfect for ambush, miles from reinforcements. Fetterman crossed the ridge. What happened next lasted 40 minutes. When relief forces finally reached the site, they found all 80 men dead. Not just killed, annihilated. The battlefield told a story of complete tactical collapse, bodies clustered in small groups where soldiers had tried to form defensive positions, empty cartridge cases everywhere, showing they'd fought hard. But fighting hard doesn't matter when you're fighting stupid. And Fetterman had ridden straight into the most sophisticated military trap constructed on the American frontier. Here's how it worked. The Sioux had studied Fort Phil Kearny for months. They knew the wood trains went out regularly. They knew soldiers would respond to attacks on those trains. They knew officers were aggressive, that they underestimated Indian forces, that they'd pursue if given the chance. So they created a deception that exploited all of those assumptions. That morning, a small war party attacked the wood train, just enough warriors to look dangerous but not overwhelming. When Fetterman's force appeared, a handful of warriors showed themselves and retreated. Not a panicked retreat, a measured withdrawal, staying just out of rifle range, moving toward Lodge Trail Ridge. It looked like opportunity. It looked like a chance to finally catch these raiders who'd been harassing the fort for months. Beyond the ridge, concealed in ravines and behind rocks, 2,000 warriors waited. 2,000, Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. Red Cloud himself had organized this. Crazy Horse was among the decoys, drawing the soldiers forward. The discipline required was extraordinary. Imagine being a warrior hidden in a frozen ravine, watching soldiers ride past your position, and not moving, not attacking too soon, waiting for the signal. The signal came when Fetterman's entire force was in the killing zone. Then the ravines exploded with warriors. The accounts from survivors in the relief party because Fetterman's command had no survivors describe a scene of coordinated chaos, warriors attacking from multiple directions simultaneously, preventing the soldiers from forming any coherent defense. Cavalry horses, panicked by the noise, by the arrows, by the sheer numbers, infantry trying to form a square, the standard defensive formation, but there wasn't time, wasn't space, wasn't any way to make European tactics work in that terrain, against that kind of enemy. 40 minutes. 80 professional soldiers, many of them Civil War veterans, wiped out in less than an hour. The psychological impact on the army was profound. Officers started calling it the Fetterman Massacre, though that word says more about their shock than about what actually happened. This wasn't a massacre, this was a battle, and the Sioux had won it through superior tactics, superior knowledge of terrain, and superior battlefield coordination. But calling it a massacre let the army avoid the terrifying truth. They were being outfought, and the Sioux weren't just winning through individual warrior skill. They'd developed a communication system that let them coordinate across hundreds of miles. Smoke signals during the day, mirror flashes to catch sunlight, complex patterns that conveyed specific messages, not primitive, sophisticated. A war party could signal its position, the size of enemy forces, the direction of movement, whether to attack or withdraw. Scouts on high points relayed information across a network that stretched from the Powder River to the Platte. When soldiers left a fort, Red Cloud's forces often knew about it within hours. When supply trains were coming, warriors could position themselves days in advance. Soldiers wrote home about this intelligence network, describing it in tones of disbelief. Lieutenant John Grummond, who would die with Fetterman, had written to his wife about seeing mirror flashes from distant hills, knowing they were being watched, knowing that somewhere warriors were discussing their movements. It was like fighting an enemy who could see everything while remaining invisible themselves. The cultural disconnect made everything worse. Soldiers didn't understand what they were facing because they couldn't imagine warfare organized this way. They'd been trained in European military tradition armies with supply lines, formal command structures, territorial objectives. The Sioux were fighting for hunting grounds, for a way of life, with tactics evolved over generations of plains warfare. When soldiers heard war cries before battle, they called them savage screaming. They didn't understand these were psychological weapons, sounds designed to inspire warriors and terrify enemies. When they saw women at battlefields afterward, taking weapons and equipment from the dead, they were horrified. They didn't understand that Sioux women were full participants in warrior culture, preparing warriors before battle, honoring them after, ensuring no weapon or useful item was wasted. The women's role was crucial. They made the clothing warriors wore, creating designs that carried spiritual protection. They processed buffalo hides for shields that could actually stop bullets at certain ranges. Layered hide, hardened, remarkably effective. They prepared food that warriors could carry for days, allowing war parties to range far from camp. They taught young boys the stories of great warriors, keeping tactical knowledge alive across generations. When men left for battle, women performed ceremonies, sang specific songs, created the spiritual framework that gave warriors their confidence. After Fetterman, the army tried to adapt. In August 1867, at the wagon box fight, they had a new advantage: breech-loading rifles. The old muzzle loaders required soldiers to stand up, pour powder, ram the bullet, prime the weapon. Slow, vulnerable. The new Springfield rifles could be loaded and fired from a prone position, and a trained soldier could fire twice as fast. Crazy Horse didn't know about the new rifles when he led warriors against a wood-cutting detail protected by 32 soldiers behind a defensive circle of wagon boxes. The standard tactic had always worked before mass charge: overwhelm the position before soldiers could reload. But this time the rifles kept firing. Warriors fell, horses fell, The charge broke against sustained fire that should have been impossible with the old weapons. 6 hours of fighting, the Sioux withdrew. It was the first clear tactical defeat Red Cloud's forces had suffered, and it showed something important: this was evolving warfare. The Sioux learned and adapted after every engagement. The army learned and adapted. New weapons changed tactics. New tactics demanded new responses. But here's what the army didn't fully understand yet. Superior weapons weren't enough. During that same period, a spiritual leader was rising among the Hunkpapa Sioux, who would prove more dangerous than any war chief. His name was Sitting Bull. Sitting Bull was 40 years old in 1867, already respected as a holy man and warrior. But what made him crucial was his ability to combine spiritual leadership with political organization. He could unite bands that normally operated independently. He could inspire warriors to continue fighting when others counseled accommodation with the whites. And he had visions. In June 1876, during the Sundance ceremony, Sitting Bull offered flesh sacrifices, 50 pieces of skin cut from each arm. For hours he danced, staring at the sun, until he fell into a trance. When he woke, he described his vision. Soldiers falling upside down into the Indian camp, like grasshoppers falling from the sky. Dead soldiers everywhere. A great victory coming. The warriors believed him. They knew his visions had been accurate before. They prepared for the battle Sitting Bull had seen, gathering in numbers the army had never faced in one place. Thousands of warriors, multiple bands, all the great leaders together. Red Cloud in his prime, Crazy Horse at his peak, Gall, who'd become a brilliant tactical commander, Rain in the Face, who'd sworn vengeance for imprisonment. And riding toward them, convinced the Indians would scatter at the first show of force, came Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and the 7th Cavalry. The greatest tactical mistake in American military history was about to unfold. June 25, 1876. The Little Bighorn River Valley in Montana Territory, the largest gathering of Plains Indians in history, somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 warriors, depending on whose estimate you trust, camped along several miles of riverbank. Sitting Bull's vision was about to become reality. George Armstrong Custer had 600 men of the 7th Cavalry. He'd been tracking the Indian village for days, following a trail so obvious that his Crow Scouts warned him it was too big, too many people, more than the entire 7th Cavalry could handle. Custer didn't believe them. He'd fought Indians before. They always scattered when soldiers attacked, hit them hard and fast, and they'd run. He was about to learn the difference between fighting scattered bands and fighting a unified force of the greatest light cavalry warriors in the world. Around noon, Custer made his fatal decision. He split his regiment into 3 battalions. Captain Frederick Benteen, with 125 men, would scout to the left, making sure no Indians escaped in that direction. Major Marcus Reno, with 140 men, would attack the southern end of the village. Custer himself would take 210 men and swing north, hitting the village from another direction while Reno had them distracted. Classic pincer movement. It would have worked against a conventional enemy. The Sioux weren't conventional. Reno attacked first, around 3 in the afternoon. His battalion charged toward the southern edge of the village teepees spread along the river for what looked like miles. But instead of panicking, instead of fleeing, warriors poured out to meet him. Not disorganized, not scattered, but in coordinated groups. Within minutes, Reno realized he wasn't facing a few dozen warriors. He was facing hundreds. His charge collapsed. He ordered his men to dismount and form a skirmish line in a stand of timber near the river. Private William Murphy, one of the survivors, later described what happened next. Warriors were laughing during the fight. Laughing. They'd ride close enough to draw fire, then wheel away before soldiers could aim properly. They'd shoot arrows in high arcs, so the projectiles came down almost vertically, hitting men and horses that thought they were behind cover. They used every tree, every depression in the ground, every bit of terrain. The soldiers were firing at targets that appeared and vanished like ghosts. Reno's line disintegrated. He ordered a retreat back across the river, but it turned into a rout. Men abandoned wounded comrades. Officers lost control of their troops. Warriors rode alongside fleeing soldiers, counting coups, killing at leisure. Reno's battalion made it to high ground on the other side of the river and dug in, but they'd lost a third of their men in less than an hour. While Reno was being destroyed, Custer was riding north along the bluffs above the river. He could see the village now, bigger than anything he'd imagined. Tepees stretching for 3 miles, thousands of horses. This wasn't a village, this was a moving city. But Custer had committed. He'd divided his forces based on the assumption that Indians wouldn't stand and fight. Now he was riding toward the largest concentration of warriors in Plains Indian history with 210 men, and Reno's attack had already alerted the entire village. The Sioux response was devastating in its speed and coordination. War chiefs Gall and Crazy Horse immediately organized counterattacks. Gall led warriors across the river to hit Custer from the south and east. Crazy Horse circled north and west, cutting off any retreat. Within minutes, Custer's battalion was surrounded on a hill above the river, and this is where Sioux tactical superiority became absolutely clear. The terrain Custer had chosen for his last stand had ravines cutting through it, natural trenches that let warriors advance within 100 yards of the soldiers without being seen. The Sioux used these ravines like siege works, moving closer and closer while staying protected. When they reached good positions, they'd fire volleys, then drop back into cover before return fire could hit them. They weren't charging into the guns. They were using the land itself as a weapon. 2 Moons, a Cheyenne chief fighting alongside the Sioux, described the scene later. The soldiers were shooting like drunk men, he said. Wild, panicked fire. They weren't aiming. They couldn't see their targets most of the time. Meanwhile, Sioux warriors were taking aimed shots from protected positions, picking off horses first to immobilize the cavalry, then focusing on the soldiers. Custer tried to organize charges to break out of the encirclement. Impossible. Every time cavalry tried to form up, warriors would appear from the ravines, fire a volley, and disappear. Horses were falling, men were falling. The defensive perimeter kept shrinking as soldiers pulled back to the hilltop. What's remarkable about this battle, what military historians still study today, is the level of tactical coordination the Sioux maintained without formal military communication systems. No radio, no signal flags, just war chiefs who'd trained together, fought together, who understood each other's movements instinctively. When Gall pressed from one direction, Crazy Horse would hit from another, preventing the soldiers from concentrating their fire. When one group of warriors needed to fall back to get more arrows, another group would increase pressure to keep the soldiers pinned. The Sioux had learned from previous fights. They knew cavalry was useless without horses. They knew soldiers with single-shot rifles needed time to reload. They knew that if you kept men under pressure, exhausted them, killed their officers first, the entire unit would collapse, and they were implementing these lessons with precision. Captain Frederick Benteen, who'd survived by joining up with Reno's battered battalion, later wrote something extraordinary. He said the Sioux showed generalship more than equal to our own. This from a career army officer, admitting that the enemy had outfought them tactically. He criticized Custer's decisions, called the entire campaign a disaster, but he was honest about one thing: the Sioux had been the better army that day. By 5 o'clock, 2 hours after the fighting started on Custer's Hill, it was over. Every man in Custer's immediate command was dead, 210 soldiers killed, many of them in the final minutes when warriors overran the hilltop position. The bodies told the story of the last moments, tight clusters where men had gathered for final stands, brass cartridges everywhere showing they'd fought to the end, but overwhelmed by sheer numbers and superior tactical positioning. Rain in the face, the warrior who'd sworn vengeance against Custer, was there in the final assault. He later claimed to have cut out the heart of one of Custer's brothers, though whether this actually happened or was embellished for storytelling is uncertain. What's certain is that the 7th Cavalry had been destroyed as a fighting force. Sitting Bull's vision had come true. Soldiers had fallen upside down into the camp. The greatest victory in Plains Indian military history had been achieved not through superior numbers. The Sioux had maybe 2-to-1 advantage at most, but through superior tactics, superior use of terrain, and superior coordination. But even as warriors celebrated, even as women moved through the battlefield, gathering weapons and honoring the dead, the older chiefs knew something terrible. Sitting Bull knew it. Red Cloud knew it. They'd won the battle. They'd proven they could defeat the United States Army in open combat. And that meant the United States would never stop coming for them now. The Army called it Custer's Last Stand, making it about one officer's heroism. The Sioux called it the Battle of the Greasy Grass, and they knew what it really was, the beginning of the end. Because you can't defeat the United States in battle and expect them to simply go away. You can't humiliate their military and expect peace. What came next wouldn't be warfare. It would be annihilation. The greatest tactical victory in Sioux history was also their death sentence. And the weapon that would finally defeat them wouldn't be cavalry or rifles or better generals. It would be something far more devastating than any military force. The buffalo died first. Not in battle. Not honorably. They died by the millions, shot from trains by hunters who took only the hides and left the meat to rot on the plains. By 1883, maybe 1,000 buffalo remained from herds that had once numbered in the tens of millions. This wasn't accident. This was policy. General Philip Sheridan said it explicitly. Kill the buffalo, and you kill the Indian way of life. No amount of tactical genius could defeat starvation. The warriors who'd destroyed Custer's battalion scattered after Little Bighorn. They knew what was coming. The army mobilized thousands of troops, not hundreds. They built forts throughout the Powder River country. They hunted Sioux bands through winter, attacking camps when warriors were with their families, when escape was impossible. This wasn't warfare. This was extermination campaign. Crazy Horse surrendered in May 1877. The warrior who'd never lost a battle, who'd coordinated the destruction of the 7th Cavalry, walked into Fort Robinson with his band and handed over his weapons. 4 months later, soldiers bayoneted him during a scuffle. Whether it was murder or accident doesn't really matter. The symbol was gone. Sitting Bull fled to Canada, stayed for 4 years, then came back when his people were starving. He surrendered in 1881. The holy man, whose vision had predicted Little Bighorn, spent his final years touring with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, a living museum piece performing for crowds who'd come to see the savage who'd killed Custer. The humiliation must have been unbearable. But something else was happening in those years after military defeat. Something desperate and beautiful and doomed. The ghost dance movement swept through reservation communities starting in 1889. A Paiute prophet named Wovoka had a vision. If the people performed this specific dance, if they followed certain rituals, the white men would disappear. The buffalo would return. Dead warriors would come back to life. The world would be renewed. Think about what that meant. Think about the desperation required to believe that dancing could resurrect the dead, could undo decades of defeat and displacement. But the ghost dance wasn't just about hope. It was about preserving warrior culture in the only way left. The dances taught young people songs they'd never heard, stories they'd never been allowed to tell, movements that carried meaning from before the reservations. The army panicked. They saw thousands of Indians dancing, wearing special shirts they believed would stop bullets, talking about the disappearance of white people. They saw rebellion. In December 1890, they sent soldiers to arrest Sitting Bull at his cabin on the Standing Rock reservation. In the chaos, Indian police Sioux men working for the government shot him. The great holy man died at the hands of his own people, caught between worlds that couldn't coexist. 2 weeks later came Wounded Knee. The 7th Cavalry, Custer's old regiment, reconstituted and hungry for revenge, intercepted a band of Minneconjou Sioux under Chief Bigfoot. They were heading to Pine Ridge Reservation, cold and starving. The soldiers surrounded them, demanded they surrender all weapons. Someone fired a shot. Nobody knows who. It doesn't matter. The Hotchkiss guns opened up. 4 rapid-fire cannons pouring explosive rounds into the camp at point-blank range. Warriors tried to fight back with knives and clubs and the few weapons they'd hidden. They were wearing ghost dance shirts, believing they'd be protected. The shirts didn't stop bullets. Nothing stopped bullets. When the shooting ended, between 250 and 300 Lakota were dead, 2/3 of them women and children. The 7th Cavalry had their revenge. The ghost dance died in the snow at Wounded Knee. But here's what the army couldn't kill with bullets: knowledge. The tactical innovations the Sioux had developed didn't disappear. They spread. In 1891, the army completely rewrote its cavalry manual. The new edition included tactics directly lifted from Sioux warfare: use of terrain for concealment, coordinated attacks from multiple directions, the importance of mobility over static defense, shooting from horseback in broken terrain. West Point started teaching case studies of Red Cloud's War and Little Bighorn not as examples of American victory, but as master classes in light cavalry tactics. Officers being trained for service in the Philippines, in Cuba, anywhere irregular warfare was expected, studied how the Sioux had used intelligence networks and hit-and-run tactics. When American forces faced guerrilla fighters in the 20th century, the 10 counter-tactics they developed came partly from hard lessons learned on the Great Plains. The Sioux had forced the United States Army to evolve. Even today, military historians study Little Bighorn, the coordination between Gall and Crazy Horse, the use of terrain, the psychological warfare, the way warriors maintained tactical flexibility, while implementing a coherent battle plan. It's taught at staff colleges as an example of how to defeat a technologically superior force through superior tactics. The warriors who couldn't read or write military manuals had created doctrine that would influence warfare for generations. But the real survival happened in secret, on reservations, under the eyes of government agents who wanted to erase every trace of warrior culture. The knowledge survived. Grandmothers taught grandsons. Not openly, not in ways that would attract attention. But the stories stayed alive. The tactics stayed alive. Beadwork patterns carried coded information about battles. The colors, the arrangements, they told stories of specific fights, specific acts of courage. Women who'd been forbidden to speak about war in English would create patterns that preserved those memories for anyone who knew how to read them. It was tactical documentation, hidden in art. In the 1960s and 70s, something unexpected happened. Vietnam veterans, including Native American soldiers, came home and sought out their traditional cultures. Some found elderly men on reservations who still remembered warrior training. The Vision Quest tradition was revived. Young men went back into the wilderness, seeking the same spiritual preparation their great-grandfathers had found. They learned that being a warrior wasn't about killing. It was about protecting your people, about facing fear with absolute commitment, about tactical intelligence combined with spiritual purpose. Modern powwows preserve the warrior traditions openly now. The dances aren't just entertainment, they're living history. The movements teach tactics: how warriors moved in battle, how they signaled each other, how they demonstrated courage. Young people learning traditional dances are learning military doctrine passed down through 5 generations. On Pine Ridge Reservation today, elderly men teach their grandchildren to ride horses the old way, not Western riding. Plains Indian riding, gripping with the knees, hands free, the rider and horse moving as one unit. They teach the importance of reading terrain, of patience in hunting, of mental toughness. They don't usually say they're teaching military tactics, but that's what it is. The knowledge that terrified the United States Army survived, transformed into cultural practices that the government couldn't quite justify banning. The Sioux proved something that military historians recognize but politicians often forget. Technological superiority doesn't guarantee victory. The warriors who defeated Custer didn't have better weapons. They had better tactics, better use of terrain, better coordination, and absolute commitment to their cause. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their entire way of life. That gave them an advantage no weapon could match. In the end, they lost. Not because their tactics failed, but because tactics alone can't defeat industrial civilization. You can't outfight economic warfare. You can't use cavalry mobility against railroad logistics. You can't preserve hunting grounds against millions of settlers. Military genius isn't enough when the enemy has unlimited resources and no constraints on how total their war can be. But the legacy remains. Every time a small force uses terrain and mobility to fight a larger enemy, every time guerrilla tactics defeat conventional military doctrine, every time someone studies asymmetric warfare, they're building on innovations the Sioux perfected on the Great Plains. The warriors are gone. The buffalo are gone. The way of life they fought for is gone. The tactics survived. Knowledge survives. And on summer evenings on the northern plains, if you know where to look, you can still see elderly men teaching young people to ride, to observe, to think tactically, to face fear with calm determination. The warriors became phantoms at the end. But phantoms leave marks on the world. The Sioux marked military history forever, and those marks won't fade.